Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at bog burials from the Iron Age and how they've been framed. So bog burials are people who have been drowned or violently killed and then buried in bogs, and there are quite a few finds of this in Denmark. And there's some in Germany and the British Isles as well. I'll be looking at Denmark and honing in on a specific example of it, which is a very well-preserved body called Graubøllemænd. So these people were killed in the Iron Age and then deposited, buried in bogs. And the reason why these finds are out of the ordinary is because the chemical environment in bogs is not conducive for organic living organisms. So the acidic and low oxygen content of the bogs basically almost stops the decomposition of the bodies, makes it very, very slow. So when these bodies were unearthed many years later, their skin is intact, their hair is intact, the contents of their digestive system is very well preserved, and so they're quite amazing finds. And you have them on display in different museums in Denmark. The window of these burials is the Iron Age, going from the late Iron Age, from the early Iron Age until the late Iron Age. So there's a window of about 1000 BC until a couple of centuries after Christ, where most of the bodies are found within that window. Now the framework, how they are framed, the predominant narrative connected to the bodies from the archaeological community is that they are ritual sacrifices. So these are ritual sacrifices to the fertility god or goddess or gods in order to improve crops. And there are different reasons for this, which we'll look into. So personally for me, this framing on an intuitive level always struck me as odd for different reasons. And I started looking into what sources, the oldest sources, written sources and oral traditions in the North we have concerning these finds are. And it's a very good filter. In my experience, I've had a lifelong interest in history, archaeology, religion and faith, and it's my main interest. And over the years, I've seen that one of the most effective filters to predict if a given theory on the area will have a long half-life or a short half-life, will stand or will fall, is seeing if the given theory harmonizes with whatever we have of written sources or oral traditions concerning that area it pertains to and the time it pertains to. If there's not a harmony between those sources and the theory concerning that time and area, that culture, then that theory usually falls, has a shorter half-life. And so when I see that the written sources and traditions concerning bog burials in the Northern Europe aren't in harmony with the narrative that is being told, it's a big red flag for me. But we need to look closer at it because many times these same sources are taken as a basis for the prevailing theories. So the example I'm going to be looking a little closer at is, as a clear example, is a Graubøllemænd man who's exhibited at Moskva Museum outside Aarhus. A very nice museum, and they have very, very good Viking Age, Bronze Age exhibitions. They have very, very good temporary exhibitions. It's a very good museum. And they also have this fantastic find of Graubøllemann, which was a person who was buried, dated to, they put the date to 390 BC at the museum. That's kind of like the oldest date. Maybe according to the carbon dating, it could also be a little bit later, but it's a completely fine dating, 390 BC. So with Graubøllemann, let's first read the presentation text, part of the presentation text for Moskva Museum about Graubøllemann, and you can find this online as well. Was the Graubøllemann sacrificed to the gods? An autopsy of the Graubøllemann allowed researchers to identify his final meal. The contents of his stomach were so well preserved that we know what he ate before his death more than 2,000 years ago. Analysis revealed seeds from 70 different plant species, grains, and fragments of pig bone, along with a spoonful of quartz grit. The mixture contained plants and grains from the entire agricultural year. People in the Iron Age ate a great deal of meat, which makes it remarkable that Graubøllemann, like several other bog bodies, had a meal consisting mainly of crops from the whole farming cycle before his execution. The final meal suggests that the Graubøllemann was sacrificed to the goddess of fertility. After the discovery of the Graubøllemann, archaeologist and Professor P.V. Glob proposed a theory. Europe's bog bodies were offerings to the gods. Archaeological finds and Roman accounts of the wild tribes of northwestern Europe indicate that human sacrifice took place in Iron Age Europe during the first millennium BC. And now come 4 quotes from that Moskva Museum has from Roman sources. Among the Celts, it is customary to offer human beings as sacrifices to the gods. Diodorus Siculus, Bibliotheca Historica. They believe that the divine power of the gods cannot be appeased unless a human life is given in exchange for another. Therefore, they have public sacrifices of this kind. Gaius Julius Caesar, De Bello Gallico, 50 BC. It was also customary to perform human sacrifices and to dedicate men to the gods in times of great danger. Strabo, Geographica, 7 BC to AD 25. Traitors and deserters they hang from trees, but cowards, the unfit for war and the dishonored, they drown in mud and bogs after covering them with wickerwork. Tacitus, Germania, AD 98. And then the museum adds a disclaimer. We should, however, read the Roman and Greek sources with caution. They had political motives for portraying the Celtic and Germanic tribes as barbarians. Even so, modern research confirms that many bog bodies were indeed ritual sacrifices, people who were executed and offered to the gods. So that's kind of like the narrative framework presented at the museum. It's also the most common way to present these finds. Now, starting from a completely intuitive human level, like I said, I always found this narrative odd. That when I was looking at Graubøllemann, I was looking at a sacrifice for Njord or Frey or equivalent at the time. Because like in life, being in nature, you always want to avoid bogs. Out of all the environments in Denmark, it's the least conducive to life. It's the most one of the most hostile environments. Nothing grows there. You can't farm there. It's not a very nice environment, and it's also dangerous. Like I grew up in Norway, and we were always told when in the mountains to avoid the bogs, because or be very careful at least. Because you never know how deep a sinkhole in a bog is. And for a child, it can be, even an adult, it can be life-threatening if you sink through. So these, like on a practical level, everything surrounding it is not good. And then if you also take into account all the fairy tales, the language connected to it, all the culture connected to bogs, it's always mysterious, a bad place. It's never, you never read a poem that framed the bog as the beautiful bog under the clear blue sky. It's always a mysterious and dangerous place, and you have like in the fairy tales in the folk fairy tales in Norway, it's always a place of death. So culturally, there's kind of no end to the supernaturally bad beings that exist in bogs and can trick you to a certain death. And I couldn't, connect either the sagas to this. I never encountered this in the sagas or Saxo. But this has always just been my intuition and kind of natural feeling that I was reading something that I couldn't engage with because it didn't feel like the truth at all. But we have to look closer at the actual ancient sources and what they say, because on the surface of how they're presented, it does seem that they support the thesis that these were ritual sacrifices to the gods. Now, the first one, a natural one to look at, is Tacitus, whom Moscow Museum and also the professor mentioned in Moscow Museum's plaque, Professor P.V. Glob, uses as part of his thesis. So, just shortly on Glob, he was the one who kind of popularized this way of understanding bog burials with a book called Mosefolket, or the Bog People. I think it was published in 1965. But of course, there'd been a lot of research before that. But that kind of was a kind of a watershed moment in how we talk about these burials. So Tacitus is central to the shaping of this narrative. So there are two passages that are referred to usually, and the first passage is concerning an actual ritual sacrifice. So it's Tacitus' description of the Nerthus ritual among Germanic peoples, and the Nerthus is usually taken as an equivalent of Njord, and is a fertility god or a goddess. And the Germanic peoples he's describing here are the North Germanic peoples and the Danish areas. Next come the Rödini, Aviones, Angli, Varini, Eudosus, Suarinus, and the Newtonus, protected by rivers or forest. There's nothing noteworthy about these tribes individually, but they share a common worship of Nerthus, that is Mother Earth. They believe that she intervenes in human affairs and rides among the peoples. On an island in the ocean, there's a sacred grove, and in it a consecrated chariot covered with a cloth. Only one priest is permitted to touch it. He perceives when the goddess is present in her sanctuary and follows with great reverence as she is drawn by heifers. Then the days are joyful, and the place is festive, which she honors with her arrival and stay. They do not go to war or take up arms. All iron is locked away. Peace and quiet are known and lovely only at this time. Until the same priest returns, the goddess, sated with the company of mortals, to her temple. Soon afterwards, the chariot, the cloth, and if you choose to believe it, the deity herself, are washed in a secluded lake. Slaves perform this service, and the same lake immediately swallows them up. From this arises a mysterious dread and a pious ignorance about what that thing may be, which only those doomed to die ever behold. So the sacred grove on an island is usually connected to Zealand, the island adjacent to South Sweden, Danish, large island, and Leire, which is the old cult and important area in Zealand, Sjælland. The tribes he's speaking of here are, you can even see in the names, the Angli are the Angeln, Eudoses are the Jutes, and generally it's the North German and Danish areas that he's talking about here. Now Glob and many others point to this passage, and of course we have examples of burials on water in many other sources of the north. We have the ship burials in the sagas, and of course water is central in many cultures, and even look at Christianity and baptism. So water is very often seen as an agent of purification. What we don't have is baptism in a bog, or a magnificent burial on the bog, or a king being carried out and being laid to rest in the marshes or the bog. We simply don't have. It's a completely different environment than the mud of a bog. The dirty water of a bog is completely different than the pure water of a lake. One might want to take that parallel, but I wouldn't say that the writing supports it. Especially not considering that the second passage that also is taken to support the thesis explicitly mentions bogs in a quite different context. Tacitus writes, "Punishment in these tribes varies according to the crime. Traitors and deserters they hang on trees, cowards, shirkers, and those guilty of infamous vices they plunge into the mud and mire of a marsh or swamp, with a hurdle wicker crate thrown over them. This difference in punishment has regard to the idea that crimes should be made public when they are avenged, whereas acts of shame ought to be hidden away." And this is the same passage Moskor quotes part of. And it's very, very clearly talking about a context of punishing the most vile criminals in society, and that the purpose of putting them in a bog is to hide them away because of the shame they have brought upon society and the shame they represent. So they are hidden away from humans, from gods, in the least beautiful place where life doesn't really take, the bog. And so the leap of faith that is often taken by the prevalent narrative here is that or the use of imagination is that this again connects to the lake. But this isn't what Tacitus is saying. He's saying straightforwardly and quite clearly that the bog is reserved for the most vile criminals. And he says nothing about that being an offering to the gods. So that requires some extra conjecture, some extra imagination. And you can see this is implied in the 3 quotes chosen by the museum. First, about human sacrifice, which of course was prevalent in the Germanic areas, as in many other areas. But none of them mention bogs. And the one quote that does mention bogs doesn't mention human sacrifice. So the connection there is at least going from those sources that they chose as main ones, kind of a made-up connection. Also, the disclaimer that we should be careful with trusting Greek and Roman sources. And of course, every source should be treated with a bit of care and a bit of caution. But Tacitus is generally, now this is not controversial, he's generally seen as a quite neutral observer. When he talks about the Germanic peoples, he praises many aspects. There are pros and there are cons to their life, and he contrasts it with the pros and cons of Roman society and life. But not, any different than if you had a modern viewpoint looking at Roman society, or looking at, for that sake, like a European perspective on Asian society, or the other way around, would also be, they do this, I like that, I don't like that, compared to what we do. But it's from my viewpoint. And Tacitus isn't any different there. He's not like a propagandist or anything. So this disclaimer, I feel, it doesn't pertain particularly to Tacitus. So are there any other ancient sources in the north or about the north that mention burials, bogs, and sacrifices? So in the north, we're lucky that the Scandinavian countries were very particular and detailed in their law giving from an early time. And they also put the laws down in manuscripts. So around 1200, Danish law, Norwegian law, many of the Scandinavian countries' laws were put down in writing. And it is a general consensus that especially the secular laws pertaining to crime, punishment, and inheritance are very, very old laws and traditions. And they reach back into pre-Viking Age, Iron Age traditions most likely, and maybe even further. And in these early laws, we do find laws concerning burials in bogs. And in Denmark, we find very specific laws, and this is the country where many of the bog bodies are found. So if you look at the law of King Valdemar II, the law of Zealand, which is the island we mentioned before, where Tacitus talked about the lake ritual. Here we have the law of Zealand, Book 3, Chapter 57, encoded in writing around between 1220 and 1240. I read it in my broken Danish first, and then translate it. Om den som gør nidingsværk, eller manddrab, eller hor, eller tager kvinde med vold, eller er tyv, eller mandsbane, eller landsforræder, eller bryter fred, eller slår sin herre eller husbånd, den skal man hænge, eller steile, eller grave ned i os, eller i grus, eller på strand, hvor sø og land mødes. Hvor hverken plov bider, eller sæd kommer, og hans arvinger skal ingen arv have efter ham, og hans gård skal brændes, eller rives ned. And a quick rough English translation. The one who does nidingsverk, which is villainous crimes, like really morally depraved crimes, examples being like striking deadly blows from behind, really egregious sexual crimes, incest, and so forth. Breaking oath, which was super serious, oath breakers. So the one who does nidingsverk, villainous crimes, or kills, or is adulterous, or rapes a woman, or is a thief, or is the cause of another man's death, or a traitor, or breaks the peace, or strikes his lord. They shall be hanged or stylet, and I'll explain that shortly, or they shall be buried in os or in eller i grus. So quickly, styling was a method that became prevalent, probably coming from continental Europe around this time. You would tie up the perpetrator on a giant cartwheel and using blunt weapons you would break all the bones of their body, smash them, and then you would kind of weave the body in the struts of the wheel, so they're kind of woven into the wheel and put on display to die. Really a horrible punishment. And then it says buried in os eller I grus eller på strand hvor sjø og land møtes. This is buried in os is wetlands, marshes, areas that are inundated by rivers, bogs. So wetlands, or on gravel, in gravel, like rocky land, or on the beach where sea and land meet. Areas where varken plow, bider eller säl kommer. This means areas where the plow doesn't bite and the seed doesn't take. So bogs and marshes, gravelly ground, or where the tide washes. These are areas where the plow won't bite and the seed won't take. These were the areas reserved for burying the absolute worst criminals. And then it says his inheritors shall not take inheritance after him, and his farm shall be burned down or destroyed. And this is the law of Zealand. And here it says very clearly, and it mirrors completely what Tacitus is saying about the different punishments, hanging, and then or burying in the marsh for even worse crimes. But almost the exact same provision is found in the law of Jutland and the law of Scandia. So Jutland is also this modern day Jutland, and the law of Scandia is Skåne. It's was part of Denmark. Within the Dane area, it's southern Sweden, southernmost part of Sweden. Has the exact same provision with the exact same methods, and also in Norway you have in the same time frame the exact same in the Frostating, Gulating, all the different laws, regional laws. You have the same provisions being given. Except that os isn't included there, which kind of makes bogs, which kind of makes sense, because in Norway, with the topography there, most people live in the valleys and in the fjords, and you only find big bog areas and marshes in the highlands and in the mountainous areas. So it wouldn't be, practical to expend a lot of energy to find a bog in Norway to bury your criminal. It'd be really far away from where people live. What they do specify in Norway, which is interesting, is that where the sea meets land provision, they should be buried under the high tide line. So what happened was they would tie people's hands and feet, lay them on the beach under the high tide line, and as the tide comes in, they drown. But otherwise, it's the same thing as the Danish laws. That it also mentions it. The main point is burying them where the plow doesn't take and the plow doesn't bite and the seed doesn't take. That's the main point. And as the consensus is, these laws reflect much older traditions. So it fits very snugly in with how Tacitus describes North Germanic or Germanic traditions. So burial as a punishment for crimes is quite clearly related to bogs. Question is, how about bog sacrifices? Because that's the connection that needs to be made. Do we find this in our old sources? And here we have to remember that, of course, not compared with all the continental European Latin manuscripts of the Iron Age, which are in the thousands and thousands, but pre-Christian scripts of European culture, like the vast majority are in Scandinavia. I think in Germany you have very, very few that describe, that are written before 1400 and describe pre-Christian culture. But in Scandinavia you have hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts, sagas, that describe affairs pertaining to pre-Christian times. So this is like the main body of knowledge we have of traditions of this area. So it's not, to be taken lightly. So do this vast repository, does it mention bog sacrifices? Well, human sacrifice is mentioned many times in the sagas and by different methods. Hanging and spearing, so you would be hung and speared. This was the Odin sacrifice. There's mentioned of they would break the backs, and Tacitus mentions the lake, but never once is a bog mentioned, or a marsh, as a place for sacrificing to the fertility god. Not once. The Danish historian Saxo, which wrote in Latin, but he wrote extensively about pre-Christian times, and he also mentions human sacrifice. And again, the method he describes is hanging and spearing, like in the sagas, but he never mentions once in his large work a single sacrifice on a bog or a ritual as a homage to the gods. Adam of Bremen, who visited these areas, who's very interesting, and I would very much suggest people read him. He gives quite a level-headed and from a Christian perspective, but a very level-headed, surprising view of society in Viking times in Scandinavia. He also mentions human sacrifice by hanging in groves, like tree groves, beautiful tree groves in Sweden, and cremation rituals for sacrifice. But he never mentions any sacrifice in a bog. So I became a little bit curious in order, to either support or not support, find cracks in this idea I had that the narrative was framed in a wrong way. How do kind of other cultures in the world and their written and oral traditions from old times, do they mention ritual sacrifices in bogs? Or do they mention bog burials? And in what way do they mention? So I used Grok's paid AI to do many searches and really rigorously try to find examples in older traditions of ritual sacrifices to the on the bogs to the fertility gods, or just any ritual sacrifice performed in connection with marshes and bogs. And I did it pretty extensively with a good AI, and it basically turned up with this doesn't exist in any traditions anywhere. No cultures mention this kind of activity. What they do mention in different cultures are punishment being enacted by being buried in bogs. So basically, similar to what we've had in German, what's called Germania, so northern half of Germany and going up into Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, and also probably in Celtic areas. Similar to that. So the written tradition and oral traditions of our culture and other cultures doesn't support this. So it requires imagining new things up in order to make these links and make these connections. And that's a tricky area to start doing, especially when in my opinion, there are very clear examples of what was done when burying on the bog in the written traditions. So what does the archaeology say about this? So in case with the Graubøllemann, he was very well preserved, so they could do extensive examinations. What did he eat, and so forth. And there's a study that is like central to understanding Graubøllemann, written by Professor Hans Helbæk, and published in the 50s, 1958, as I remember. And which is a super detailed and very, very good study that goes through everything that was found in his digestive system and maps it out. And this is the basis of, for example, Moscow Museum's different statements concerning his final meal. So we first read what Moscow Museum says about this. Analysis revealed seeds from 70 different plant species, grains, and fragments of pig bone, along with a spoonful of quartz grit. The mixture contained plants and grains from the entire agricultural year. People in the Iron Age ate a great deal of meat, which makes it remarkable that Graubøllemann, like several other bog bodies, had a meal consisting mainly of crops from the whole farming cycle before his execution. The final meal suggests that the Graubøllemann was sacrificed to the goddess of fertility. So they're making some clear statements here that this was a meal collected of grains and seeds from the whole plant materials from the whole season, and therefore it's something unique. And they state that Iron Age people ate a great deal of meat, and therefore it is unique that this meal doesn't contain a lot of meat, only small fragments of pig bone. On the basis of this, they then state that this points to it being a ritual meal before a sacrifice for the fertility god. So let's have a closer look at this, because they're basing this off Helbæk's study. So Helbæk's study mentions the theoretical framing of sacrifices as a current prevalent theory, and that the findings he find don't necessarily oppose this, though he knacks the lack of archaeological evidence supporting the hypothesis. But he does in several places note that his finds could support a ritual sacrifice theory. But let's look a little bit closer on how he words those parts. So if we first take the idea that this is a unique meal because it doesn't contain meat, and Iron Age people ate a lot of meat. So already in the introduction to the resume of the paper, Helbæk makes a statement that contradicts this, and which also his statement is based on the research on what Iron Age people ate in Denmark. And he says, "There can be no doubt that in the Iron Age very little meat was generally available in this country." And this he bases from other finds as well, not only Graubøllemann, but different finds from fireplaces where meat has been prepared, and finds in Iron Age archaeological digs, that what they find is usually different types of cultivated grain, but quite a lot of wild seeds as well, which points to that they had to complement their crops with wild seeds. And they find very little meat, like bone material, compared to, say, Neolithic times or other times where people in Denmark ate much more meat. There's very much less of that in the Iron Age. And in my view, this makes complete sense, because we know from written traditions, like if you look at the Cimbri, this massive exodus from Jutland in the around 110, 112, 18, 120 BC. There's a massive exodus out of Jutland, and it's well documented in Roman sources, because it kind of snowballs down Europe and becomes this massive army that attacks and creates a lot of problem for the Romans. And the Cimbri themselves, from Jutland, they said they had to leave Denmark because of failing crops and natural disasters. Also, we see in the archaeological record from the Iron Age that there were shifts in colder weather, so there was an adjustment over time from having cattle on free range the whole year round to adjusting to having them indoors in the winter. And I would think that in this adjustment period, when they kind of do these adjustments, you have a couple of really disastrous years where you find out there are some problems, and especially, the climate getting colder coincides generally with disease and really bad conditions. So this kind of makes sense for me in connection with that. Also Helbeck states that they ate less meat, and that the archaeological finds show this. So why the museum writes this, I don't know. It's a little bit weird and a little bit a shame, because in this context the Graubeleman had been eating very little meat in his meal, becomes a normal pattern. And the same Tollenman, his food in another moose, another bog body, doesn't have any meat. But curiously, he also in the study itself, he also reiterates this point, and he curiously then it is used to support the idea of ritual sacrifice. So we have to mention it. It has been suggested that these meals, he writes, and he's here comparing Graubeleman with Tollenman and another one called Boremoseman, are of ritual character, and that their composition reflects this. Until Graubeleman, we haven't seen meat in the food. Human sacrifice would have followed specified procedures, and one has therefore imagined that a feature of them would be that food would be of very simple nature, almost a type of prisoner food, given on their way to a better world. Now we can, as we will see later, based on the contents of their stomach and the tradition of these burials, be raised a reasonable case for ritual sacrifice through the archaeological arguments, though the archaeological arguments cannot be classified as satisfactory. So what he's saying here, as I understand it, he's eating very simple food, devoid of meat, and that's a feature of the ritual sacrifice. So eating a simple, normal prisoner food makes it ritual sacrifice food. So I guess no matter what kind of food it is, there's always going to be a theory that makes it fit with ritual sacrifice. Of course, the narrative presented at the museum is the opposite. Here, the script is flipped. He has the disclaimer, which I find very prudent, that the archaeological arguments cannot be classified as satisfactory. So it's mostly narrative driven, how you understand and interpret these things. And regarding the meal itself, he writes quite directly, there is nothing special about the Bog peoples, now he's including Tollenman and Boremoseman, last meals. And he concludes, like he goes through all the detailed things, and he concludes that it was most likely a soup, because the size of the particles from the grains were so large, so he was drinking, and it was a very meager meal, and it was most likely from the grains. He can like pretty confidently conclude that it was from the type of grains you would store throughout the year as and throughout the winter, and that would hold. And the wild seeds included are not something special. It's like he says, it's prisoner food. In fact, it's to the point where he says it's most likely they were killed in the winter because the food is so poor, it's coming from storage, and there are no fresh vegetables or flowers or anything fresh fruit in the food at all, which would be harvested in the summer, the spring, and autumn. This is not present in the meal. It's only what could be stored throughout the winter. So his conclusion is that it's most likely that these 3 bodies were killed during the winter. Now this is in opposition also to what the narrative says, that this was some kind of a meal that was procured from produce from the whole year, representing the whole year. This is not at all what the study says. It says actually the opposite, that it was select grains that you could use to store and that could hold for that. And he even mentions that it's the things that contaminate it are not what you. So there are hairs in the soup, found in the soup, that are that are from a mammal, but they're too small to be the hairs off the back of a mouse. So it's most likely from the snout, the fine hairs of the snout or the feet. So there's also this alluded to. It could even be waste material from a storage from the floor. I mean, so this is not some kind of a special and unique meal. It's prisoner food. The fact that it is in the winter, in his opinion, could support the theory that this was a ritual sacrifice. So they were killed in the winter, which could support, because that's when you would be, the most precarious situation for food, and that's when the sun starts rising again midwinter. So in that way, if they were killed in the winter, it could support the theory. And of course it could. But it does require, a little bit of a leap of imagination, and it does require disregarding all that is mentioned in the written sources. So in the aggregate, that seems flimsy. I mean, it's a possibility, and maybe one could wish it to be so, but in the aggregate with the traditions and the written evidence, it seems flimsy to me at least. Also, it could also point to the fact that if they were criminals punished for vile crimes, as the sagas and the laws and Tacitus mentions, perhaps they were in some form of captivity before they were killed, and then they weren't given fresh tomatoes, or, well, not tomatoes at that time, but fresh fruit and nice food. Maybe they were just given waste food. So that's for me just as a likely explanation. So in conclusion, I think we can it's fair and to discount the special meal argument, that this was grains, specially made meal from the bounty of the harvest of the whole year. It doesn't make sense, and it's certainly not supported by studies. So there's one last thing though, which is a stretch, but you could take in to support the theory, and that is the fact that in many sources, human sacrifice is done by hanging, and so they would be hanged for strangulation, not breaking the neck, but strangulation, and speared with a spear. And also Adam of Bremen mentions hanging as human sacrifice. And some of the bog bodies have been found with ropes around their neck. So there could be kind of a basis for saying, okay, then that is a pointer to ritual sacrifice. But also it is a pointer to criminals being hanged, and is just as likely and probably more likely because it is named as one of the main provisions for killing criminals, hanging until they are strangled to death. So that would be just as likely, and in my opinion there are more, the written source material more supports that. But you could, you could make that argument. It's just if you connect it with how that they are afterwards buried in a bog, which is exclusively in the written and oral traditions for really, really vile criminals, then you have to put two and two together, and it's not a matchup. And like in the case of Graubeleman, it doesn't. You can't use that argument because he's when he was killed, it was overkill. He was beaten with a blunt weapon. His throat was slashed. His skull was caved in, or had a big fracture. And there was no hanging. He was just sort of a victim of overkill. When looking at both things together, for me at least, looking at the traditions coded in writing, and what they are, like main archaeological studies about the Graubeleman, for example, show a quite clear picture emerges. Of course, it's not so exciting if you're gonna exhibit it to say that what you're looking at is most likely a rapist or a similar really, really crazed individual, then that it was a divine offering to the gods. But that's kind of the conclusion I would make. And yeah, for me it's important because the endeavor of history isn't about being so much about being curious and being a detective and finding out what really happened. That's not kind of at least not the motivation for me. It's kind of understanding heritage and your own and others' heritage, and developing a feeling of standing on firm ground. At least for me, that gives some kind of a confidence in my normal life. So that's kind of like, and then it's important for me to understand these things. So that's my take on that, on the bog burials, and will not refer to them as the bog ritual sacrifices henceforth. They are the bog burials, in my opinion. I hope you enjoyed it, and leave a comment, both if you enjoyed or if you find things that are, I've overlooked, or I have a completely wrong take. Please leave a comment. It's always good to get wiser.